The concept in neuroscience says that nerve cells that fire together wire together. And it's the repetition of how we think and how we behave and how we feel that causes gangs of neurons over time to repeatedly fire in the same pattern. And if we do that long enough, we hardwire the brain into a box of finite circuits that then contribute to our personality self. And so by the time we're 35 years old, 90% of who we are is a memorized set of automatic programs that are connected to emotional reactions and behaviors that become very predictable. And literally, the brain moves into a finite signature. And that's the box of the brain. So then to think outside the box then is to force the brain to fire in new sequences and new patterns and new combinations. And the one ingredient that allows us to do that is information, is knowledge. You see, every time you learn something new, you make a synaptic connection in your brain. That's what learning is.
Dr. Joe Dispenza is a leading expert in the world of neuroscience and epigenetics. His transformational journey began after a brutal cycling accident when doctors told him that he would never walk again. He has since gone on to write several New York Times best-selling books, become one of the highest-paid speakers in the world, and inspire millions of people globally with his story. In this exclusive speech from the Celebrate Your Life stage, Joe Dispenza explains how to change the way you think, modify the state of your mind and body, and live your dream life. Special thanks to Liz Dawn for partnering with us to release this exclusive content on our YouTube channel. Enjoy.
How many people here actually believe in the notion that their thoughts have something to do with their life or their destiny? Yes? Yes. So if you accept the idea that the way you think and the way you intentionally unfold conscious and unconscious thoughts, you would say then that the side effect of that produces a reality. Would you agree? And would you agree that that reality is reflected by events and circumstances that take place in your life? Yes. So then you would say your thoughts create your life. Yes. You would agree with that? Yes. So then that begs the question, why do we keep experiencing the same thing over and over again? The same relationships, the same jobs, the same circumstances. If we throw in with the idea that our thoughts control our future, then why isn't something new happening in our life? So would you agree then that if you changed the way you thought and you were able to maintain a modified state of mind and body, that something different should show up in your life? Yes? Yes? So then my next question for you is, how many of you actually woke up this morning and actually, before you began your day, intentionally created your future? Now, wait a second. You just told me that you believe that your thoughts controlled your destiny. So then if you realize that waking up and doing the same exact thing as the day before, thinking the same thoughts, performing the same actions, shutting off your alarm clock, brushing your teeth, getting in the shower, using the same shampoo, washing yourself off the same way, going through the same redundancy of predictable behaviors that are connected to predictable thoughts and feelings, going down and drinking coffee out of the same favorite mug, driving to work the same exact way, seeing the same people that push the same emotional buttons, coming home and hurrying up so you can eat, so you can hurry up and watch TV, so you can hurry up and go to bed, so you can hurry up and wake up in the morning to hurry up to get through your day. Would you say then that because you did the same exact things that your brain didn't change at all? Would you agree? Because the concept in neuroscience says that nerve cells that fire together wire together. And it's the repetition of how we think and how we behave and how we feel that causes gangs of neurons over time to repeatedly fire in the same pattern. And if we do that long enough, we hardwire the brain into a box of finite circuits that then contribute to our personality self. And so by the time we're 35 years old, 90% of who we are is a memorized set of automatic programs that are connected to emotional reactions and behaviors that become very predictable. And literally, the brain moves into a finite signature. And that's the box of the brain. So then to think outside the box then is to force the brain to fire in new sequences and new patterns and new combinations. And the one ingredient that allows us to do that is information, is knowledge. You see, every time you learn something new, you make a synaptic connection in your brain. That's what learning is. Remembering is maintaining and sustaining those connections. So this weekend, gathering all of this knowledge, all of this information, that information is circuits that you've created in your brain that now the next step, and this is the difficult step, is to apply it to your life, to personalize it, to demonstrate it, to modify your behavior in some way. And if you're successful at that, you'll produce a new experience. And the end product of every experience is called an emotion. And we can remember experiences better because we can remember how they feel. And when we're in the midst of an experience, everything we're seeing and smelling and tasting and feeling and hearing, all of our five senses are gathering all this information. And it's sending a rush of data back to the brain through 5 different pathways. And in that moment, gangs of neurons string into place to reflect whatever it was in the environment. And the moment those neurons string into place, they release a chemical. And that chemical is called feeling. And so then, if we live by the same feelings every single day, the memorized state of emotions that then contribute to our personality, we could say by the very definition of feelings and emotions, as the end product of a past experience, we're literally thinking in the past. And as a matter of fact, when we have traumatic events in our life that brand us emotionally, what most people don't know is that every time they think about that event, they produce the same chemistry in the brain and the body as if the event was happening. And so a person experiences a trauma 50 to 100 times a day. And it's the repetition of that begins to condition the body to memorize that emotion better than the conscious mind. And when the body knows better than the mind, that's called a habit. A habit is when the body is the mind. So 90% of who we are by the time we're 35 sits in a set of automatic subconscious programs that we've memorized that determine who we are. So then the person is the middle-aged housewife who has 3 children and her husband leaves her for the secretary. And the experience is so traumatic and so emotional that that person's experience that produces the strong emotion is tied to an event or something that happened in her life. And if she does not know how to control that emotional reaction from that experience, there's a refractory period of chemicals that is created. If we as human beings don't know how to control that refractory period, and we keep that emotional reaction going on for hours or days, that's called a mood. What's wrong with you? I'm in a mood. Well, what happened? Well, you see, this thing happened 3 days ago, and I'm memorizing the emotional reaction. And if we keep that mood going for weeks or months, that's called a temperament. And if we keep it going further than that for years on end, it's called a personality trait. And the way we change our personality is we change our emotions. So then the woman who's abandoned by her husband goes through the emotions of anger and unworthiness and sadness and pain. And she stops evolving emotionally from that experience. And 20 years later, you approach her and you say, "Why are you this way?" And she'll say, "I am this way because I've memorized this feeling that is then connected to an event that happened 20 years ago." And what that really translates into is, I don't know how to change. And so because I don't know how to overcome this emotion that I've become addicted to, then I'm defined by this experience that's connected to 20 years ago. Now, if the same woman has the same experience, but instead gets on with her life, has a wonderful relationship, gets a new job, starts a whole new set of experiences, travels the world, puts her kids through college with her own abilities, and you approach that woman 20 years later and you say to her, "So your husband left you 20 years ago. What do you think of that?" She would say, "It was the best thing that ever happened to me." So every time we have a thought, we make a chemical. And if you have a great thought or an unlimited thought or a joyful thought, your brain fires a set of circuits that produces a chemical for you to feel exactly the way you were just thinking. You begin to feel happy or unlimited. And by the same means, if you have a negative thought or an unhappy thought, your brain fires a set of circuits that produces a chemical that signals your body to feel unhappy or negative. Now, the moment we begin to feel the way we think, because the brain is in constant communication with the body, we begin to think the way we feel, which then makes more chemicals for us to feel the way we think and think the way we feel. And this cycle of thinking and feeling and feeling and thinking conditions the body to memorize that emotional state. And then the person says, I am unhappy. What they're really saying is that my mind and body are working together and I am in a state of unhappiness. And if we can't think greater than how we feel, we'll never change. To change is to think greater than how we feel. To think greater than the emotions that we've memorized. So then you would agree then, if you woke up every morning then, and you believe that your thoughts have something to do with your destiny, and you did the exact same thing, and you saw the exact same people, and you responded to your environment, it begs the question, does the environment control your thinking, or does your thinking control your environment? So the neuroscientific model tells us the brain is organized to reflect everything you know in your life. Every person you ever met, every experience you've ever had, every place you've ever lived, all the things you own and all the things you know how to do. That's mapped in pattern, and the brain is literally a reflection of the environment. So if we wake up every morning and we respond to the same environmental stimuli in the exact same way, we would agree then that it's the environment that's activating different circuits in our brain that's causing us to think equal to the environment. And if we're thinking equal to the environment, what do we keep creating more of? The same exact experiences. To change is to think greater than the conditions in our life. To think greater than the circumstances. To think greater than our environment. And every great person in history knew that. So here's my question. Can you believe in a future that you can't see or experience with your senses yet, but you've thought about enough times in your mind that your brain is literally changed ahead of the experience? When we successfully apply that principle, our brain is no longer a record of the past, but now it's a map to the future. And to live by that law is to live by the quantum law. Now, the quantum law says that the environment is an extension of your mind. And if you truly changed your mind, something should show up differently in your life. So most people don't wake up in the morning and have an intention. Most people don't wake up and create a new life or create a new future because most people don't believe it's true. If you knew it was true, would you ever miss a day? Come on. If you knew it was true, you'd never miss a day, right? So over the last 10 years, I've studied spontaneous remissions from disease. I traveled to 17 different countries and interviewed hundreds of people that were diagnosed with serious health conditions. Cancer, diabetes, high blood pressure, MS, lupus, chronic pain, anxiety, depression, rare genetic disorders that medical science didn't even have a solution to. And so I wanted to find out what these people had in common because they took an objective test, like a scan or a blood test, and they were treating with conventional methods, and they were either staying the same or getting worse. Then all of a sudden they got better. They just got better. And their objective test came back and showed that they were healthy again. So now when something happens once in science that's out of the ordinary, that's called an incident. Oh, there was an incident. Someone was healed of cancer. Now, if we have two events that are correlated within a certain time frame, what's that called? A coincidence. Oh, isn't that a coincidence? That person was healed and that person was healed. Now, when you start seeing it happening 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 times, we're starting to see a pattern now. We're starting to see a trend. So I wanted to know what the cause was that was producing the effect. So I want to tell you what they didn't have in common after I interviewed all these people. They weren't all men. They weren't all white. Very few were vegetarians. Very few were celibate. There were only one or two that were, religious ministers or priests or rabbis. Many of them did not have a particular religion. No one prayed to the same God or the same deity. Some of them smoked and drank and cursed. Those are the people I wanted to hang out with. But what they did have in common is that they changed their mind. And I was so blown away by the stories of simple people that I went back to school and got a degree in neuroscience because I wanted to know what was happening in their brain and mind, because I wanted to be able to document it and then be able to see if we're able to reproduce it. So I want to talk to you about the 4 things that they had in common. Now, the first thing they had in common is that every single person accepted, believed, and understood that there was a spiritual aspect within them, some immaterial aspect of them that was giving them life. You may call that the God within, or the greater mind, or the mother-father principle, or the life force, or the Holy Spirit. Doesn't matter. But they all said the same thing. If I could just connect with this intelligence, and if I could just give it some directions, a template, if I could give it an image of what I want, and I could hold that image so that it could get a very clear view, some orders, and then if I can just surrender this condition to this intelligence, maybe it'll do the healing for me. Now, there's nothing mystical about this intelligence. It's the same intelligence that's keeping your heart beating right now. Your heart beats over 2 gallons of blood per minute, over 100 gallons of blood in an hour, over 100,000 times in one day, through 60,000 miles of blood vessels. And yet your vascular system is 3% of your body weight. Did you know that you just lost 10 million cells? Oh, you just made another 10 million. Were you thinking about that? Or was there a mind much bigger than the personality, subjective mind, that gets to choose to be happy, choose or not choose, the free-willed personality? And that in one cell of your body, it goes through the order of 100,000 chemical reactions in 1 second. Now multiply that by the 70 trillion or 100 trillion cells of your body. Are you keeping track of all of those functions? You, the subjective mind, or is there an objective mind that is giving us life? Now the question is, can you develop a relationship with this mind? Just like you develop a relationship with a family member or a pet or a husband or wife, or develop a relationship with your pain. Could you develop a relationship with this intelligence? Can't see it, can't smell it, can't taste it, can't feel it. But it is the very essence that is expressing itself through us. So these people said, when my will matches its will, and when my mind matches its mind, and when my love for life matches its love for me, maybe it'll step in and do the healing for me. So then someone may say to me, well, listen, that's really great, but we know that it's the autonomic nervous system in the brain that's actually keeping your heart beating. That's what's doing it. It's a part of the brain. So I'd say, oh, really? What part of the brain is actually controlling your heartbeat? Oh, it's the limbic brain of the autonomic nervous system of the brain, of the body, that controls your heart. And I say, really? And in that particular part of the limbic brain, what tissues do that? And you would say, well, it's these tissues that organize themselves in this organ that's part of the brain, that's part of the autonomic nervous system, that controls the heartbeat. And then I would say, are there particular cells that are responsible for that? Oh yeah, these cells that control these tissues, that control these organs, that control this system of the body, is what controls the heartbeat. And then I would say, are there particular molecules or chemicals? Yes. These particular chemicals are controlled by these molecules that organize themselves into cells that controls tissues, that control organs and systems of the body. And what's making those molecules do what they do? How do they know how to do that? How do they know how to be so self-organizing? Well, it's the charge of the molecules. Oh, so it's the atoms then. Right, it's the atoms of the molecules, of the chemicals, of the tissues, of the organ, of the system of the body. Really? So what is an atom then? What is the quantum model of an atom? Do you know what it looks like? Nothing. It is nothing. It is made up of energy and consciousness. And we are that. And we are an expression of that mind that's organizing matter into form. And that intelligence is both personal and at the same time universal. That quantum intelligence that's giving you life is the same intelligence that's causing supernovas to be born in distant galaxies and keeping the planets rotating around the sun and allowing a flower to bloom. And so these people began to realize that they had to make contact with this intelligence, and they had to begin to make time for it and give it a plan. And they reasoned that because it was such a big mind, that they could surrender this condition to it and begin to allow it to do what it did best. So that's the first thing they had in common. Now, the second thing they had in common was that most of them understood that it was their own thoughts and their own reactions and their own emotional mismanagement that created their adult onset disease. They said it was my 20 years of hatred. It was my 30 years of anger. It was my 40 years of guilt. And I can't live like this any longer. And they began to realize that it was their cycle of how they thought and felt and thought that allowed them to memorize certain emotional states that became automatic programs. Now you see, 75 to 90% of every person that walks into a healthcare facility in the Western world walks in there because of a stress-related disorder. And stress is when the body is knocked out of normal chemical balance. The stress response is what the body does to reorganize itself back into order. And stressors are things that do it. And human beings have really three types of stresses. There's physical stresses like car accidents, falls, traumas, injuries. There are chemical stresses like pesticides and pollutants and hormones and foods and allergies, hormones. And then there's emotional stress or psychological stress. And you know what that is, right? Traffic jams, internet connections, second mortgages, single parenting. And do you know that what's really funny is that every stress that a human being experiences always turns out in the end to be a psychological or an emotional stress. You break your leg, you can't go to work, you can't pay your bills, that's an emotional stress. You get sick, that's a chemical stress. You feel pain, that's a physical stress. Changes your life, now you're emotionally stressed. Now it is emotional stress, by the way, that really begins to push the genetic buttons that create disease. Now think about this. You know the body's a protein-producing machine. Do you know that? Muscle cells make muscle proteins. They're called actin and myosin. Skin cells make skin proteins. It's called collagen and elastin. Stomach cells make stomach proteins. They're called enzymes. Joint cells make joint proteins. It's called synovial fluid. So the body is a protein-producing machine. Now, when the body makes a protein or a cell makes a protein, that's when the gene is turned on. So we express about 1.5% of our genes. The other 98.5% was called junk DNA. Now, out of that 98.5% that's junk and the 1% that we use to make proteins, out of that 1%, we are 98% chimpanzee. 300 genes away from a chimp. 70% rat. Some people more than others. So, if you were to take the gene out of one skin cell and stretch those genes out from end to end, it would be 6 feet tall. If you were to take out all the DNA out of your body and string it out from end to end, it would go to the sun and back 150 times. But if you took all the DNA of all the people on the planet and scrunched it together, it would fit in a grain of rice. Now, those genes that make proteins need a signal to turn on. And so when we have an experience in our environment, we encode that environmental experience, and that experience produces an emotion that then signals the gene to turn the gene on. So then we can encode that environmental information genetically. So then if you keep re-experiencing the same emotion every single day, suffering by thinking and feeling the same way for 20 years, would you agree you keep activating the same receptor site that turns on the same gene over and over again? And if you keep turning on that gene over and over again, that gene begins to wear out, just like the gears in your car. What if you take a fax of a fax of a fax of a fax? What happens over time? Gets a little blurry, doesn't it? Well, the protein structure begins to become cheaper. So what happens when we age? What happens to our bones? What happens to our skin? Collagen and elastin. What happens to our enzymes? The body starts making cheaper proteins because we keep giving it the same signal. Now, the chemicals of stress the adrenaline and the cortisone that's created from stress when we react to something in our environment, those are very strong chemicals that prepare the body for an emergency situation. It's time to run or it's time to fight. Now, human beings are so smart. Do you know that we can begin to thinking about an event ahead of time? We can begin to expect an event to happen. We can anticipate the event to happen. And because we can make thought more real than anything else, we can turn on the stress response just by thought alone. And do you know that we do that all day long? And when we turn on the stress response and we can't turn it off, now we're headed for disease. Because those chemicals of stress produce the emotional states of anger, aggression, hatred, judgment, fear, anxiety, insecurity, pain, suffering, depression. And those chemicals then turn on the brain and body for us to be focused on three things: the body, the environment, and time. We get obsessed with the way we look, what's going on in our life, what we own, what kind of car we have, how fast is this going to happen, are we going to take a break, my back hurts, my head hurts, it's too hot, it's too cold. And yet the brain is processing 400 billion bits of information every single second. But 2,000 of those bits is consistently focused on the body, the environment, and time. Now, if there is an animal in nature, and an animal is being chased by a predator, the moment the animal sees the predator, that fight or flight nervous system turns on, and that emergency reaction that's created for that animal is going to allow that animal to become very aware of its body. It's going to get a rush of adrenaline. And it's going to feel that rush of adrenaline to make it feel alive. And it's going to become very aware of the environment. Where am I going to run? How fast do I have to get there? Now, human beings do the same exact thing. And we get lost in those emotions that then cause us to become very selfish, very self-centered, very self-important, very self-serving, very self-indulgent. And so the person then gets a rush of emotional chemistry, and they begin to become addicted to that rush because it gives them a high and makes them feel alive. Just like becoming addicted to coffee. There's a rush of energy. So now think about this. If we keep mobilizing enormous amounts of energy for a threat in our life that's either real or imagined, for an emergency situation, from something we're perceiving from the external world, that external protection system gets out of balance because the internal protection system, which has to do with long-term building projects, growth and repair, there's no energy for healing. There's no energy for growth. And so if two cancer cells get together and they decide to start a community, most of the troops are out fighting a war. And there's no homeland security. So what about every condition that's immune-mediated? Cancer, rheumatoid arthritis, MS, diabetes, all immune-mediated conditions. Because cortisone from stress punches holes in the immune system. What about heart condition? If you're training your body to race, but you can't fight or you can't run because social mores say that's not acceptable, what happens to your heart? It begins to race on its own, without you. You condition it to memorize fear or stress. And what is that? High blood pressure, arrhythmias, tachycardia. And what about the brain? When we're under stress, where does most of the blood flow go? To the hindbrain and away from the forebrain. We can't think. We're more prone to react. And what about digestion? When you're under a fight or flight nervous system, where does most of the blood supply go? Extremities and away from the internal organs. So you could eat all the organic food and food combined in the right way, but if your body isn't in a state to receive all that nutrition, if food sits there and you see acid reflux or constipation or indigestion, diverticulitis, because the body is in a stressful situation. And in stress, emergency doesn't mean digest and rest. It means run and fight. So these people began to realize that they spent the majority of their life addicted to these emotional states that then became part of who they were. And they said, I have to break the habit of being myself. I can't be the same person any longer. Now, you know that genes are like on and off switches. They can turn on and turn off. And if we keep thinking and feeling the same way, we keep certain genes turned on and other genes turned off. If you take a group of type 2 diabetics and that are insulin dependent, either from a pill or an injection, and you have them sit and watch a comedy show for 1 hour, do you know that they begin to regulate their blood sugar almost within normal? 1 hour of laughter. So the scientists that did the experiment said, oh, that makes sense. You know, if you're going to laugh, you're going to contract abdominal muscles, and then you're going to use more energy, and then, of course, your blood sugar levels are going to go down after you eat a meal. But one geneticist said, really? Well, let's do an assay. And when they checked the genes of these diabetics who laughed for 1 hour, they turned on 23 genes that began to regulate their blood sugar just by laughing. Turned on new lights, turned off old lights. Why is it that a person who's subjected to very stressful conditions in their life, their hair turns gray overnight? If you take a group of men that have prostatic carcinoma and you teach them how to think differently, how to move differently, act differently, and eat differently, they turn on 200 genes just by doing something different. So we said that the end product of every experience is an emotion. And emotions brand those experiences into long-term memory. You can remember where you were on 9/11. You can remember catching that fish off the coast of Florida. But you can't remember what you had for lunch the day before, because routine lulls the brain to sleep. So these people began to realize that they had to break the habit of being themselves, and they had to unmemorize that emotion. And that's the second thing they had in common. The third thing they had in common was that they said to themselves, I have to reinvent myself. I can't be the same person any longer. I got to become somebody different. And they began to ask themselves some very important questions, what I call frontal lobe questions. Questions like, what would it be like to be happy? Who do I know in my life that's a happy person? What would I have to change about myself to live in joy? Who in history do I admire that I want to be like? And as they began to think without the environment, as they began to eliminate the environment, and as they began to sit there and answer those questions, their brain began to fire in new sequences, in new patterns, and in new combinations. And whenever we make the brain work differently, we just changed the mind. Mind is the brain in action. Mind is the brain at work. So if we're able to make the brain work differently, we're just making a new mind. Now, here's my question. Do you think that you can change your brain just by thinking differently? Come on, you do?
Yes.
So if you take a group of people that never played the piano and you teach them one-handed finger exercises, scales and chords, and you do a functional scan of them before they learn the activity and then do a functional scan after, and they practice for 2 hours a day for 5 days, those people who learn the scales and chords at the end of 5 days grow a whole new set of circuits on the opposite side of their brain. Well, that makes sense. You learn something new. We said learning's making new connections. You get some instruction, which means you're going to teach your body how to do that. When you actually perform it and have the experience, more neurons wire together, so we put more hardware in place. If you pay attention to what you're doing and you repeat it, you grow new circuits. That's how the brain evolves. But if you take another group of people and you say, listen, instead of you actually playing the scales and chords physically, we want you to close your eyes and we want you to mentally rehearse playing those scales and chords. Do you know that at the end of the experiment, those people grow the same amount of circuits as the people who physically demonstrate the action? Which means, not only do we change our brain just by thinking, but when we're truly focused and we're truly paying attention, the brain does not know the difference between what's happening out there and what's happening in here. So those people who are actually mentally rehearsing the new ideal of themselves, they were actually forcing the brain to work in new ways and preparing the brain with new circuits that would become the very foundation or the stage of who they would be. So you may say to me, well, Joe, that's really great. It changed their brain, but it didn't change anything about their body. Well, if you take a group of people and you have them practice pulling a spring for an hour a day for 4 weeks, these people will have a 30% increase in muscle strength at the end of 4 weeks. Well, that makes sense, right? You put a load on a muscle, you resist it, fibers tear down, the proteins grow back bigger to handle a bigger load. That's normal physiology. But if you take another group of people and you have them close their eyes and mentally rehearse pulling that spring, at the end of 4 weeks, their finger is 22% stronger, but they've never touched the spring. So we could say now that not only is the brain changed to look like the experience has already happened, but now the body looks like the experience has already happened. In other words, the body looks like it had been pulling the spring for 4 weeks. So these people then who began to think about a new ideal of themselves began to literally make a new mind and recondition their body to a new mind. And every day they went and reproduced that same level of mind. And because of my experience with these people, when I wake up in the morning now, I ask myself the same question every day. What is the greatest ideal of myself that I could be? And what if you asked yourself that question and then you said, I'm not going to get up until I am this person. So instead of waking up and doing the memorized things that you typically do, you begin to rehearse a new ideal of yourself, make your brain work in new combinations, and then once you begin to feel like that new ideal, the moment you begin to feel it, you're conditioning your body now to a new mind. And if you have mind and body working together, and you're able to maintain that state, independent of the environment, now the environment should reorganize itself to reflect your very intention. Now, you know the hardest part about doing it, though, is making the time to do it. That's it. Most people would rather say, oh, I'll start tomorrow, too tired, it's too hot out, I got gas, I got a case of the Mondays, a case of the Tuesdays. And whenever we use feelings as a barometer for change, we'll always talk ourselves out of greatness.
My name is Liz Dawn, and I'm with Celebrate Your Life Events. And the presentation that you've been listening to was recorded live at one of our Celebrate Your Life conferences. And this program was created exclusively for Evan's audience. And I'm super thrilled to share this information with you. So come check us out. Take a look at all of our retreats and programs and conferences that we have to offer. Click the link below, and hopefully I'll see you in person. All right, now let's get back to the presentation.
Because the moment we begin to change the way we think and feel, we break the chemical continuity that we've memorized, and the body goes into chaos. And the body starts sending signals back to the brain and says, you're a loser, start tomorrow, this doesn't feel good, you're too much like your mother, you'll never change. And the moment we listen to those voices in our head, we return back to the old self. But these people who began to reinvent a new ideal of themselves, what they didn't know that they were doing is that they were literally, just like the piano players, reorganizing the circuits in their brain to fire in new ways. And when they started to feel like that new ideal, they were reconditioning the body to a new mind. And when they got up as mind and body, they were literally somebody else. That's the third thing they had in common. Now, the last thing they had in common, which I found the most fascinating, was that during their process of reinvention, where they sat down and closed their eyes and began to think about who they wanted to be, that they had long moments where they lost track of time and space. In other words, they were so involved with what they were thinking about, so immersed in their rehearsal, that when they opened their eyes, they expected it to be 20 minutes later, and it was an hour and 20 minutes later. Now, part of the brain that makes us so unique as human beings is called the frontal lobe. It is 40% of our entire brain. The next closest species, primates like gibbons and chimpanzees, it's about 14 to 17%. Dogs, it's about 7%. You cat lovers, 3.5%. That's it. So if your cat is smarter than you, gives you an idea how much of that you're using. Now, the frontal lobe is the crowning achievement of the human being. It's what separates us from every other species. 40% of the entire brain. It's not the fact that we have opposing thumbs or we stand on 2 feet or that we have little body hair or that our eyes point straight ahead or that we have big brains. Elephants have bigger brains than us. What makes us so unique is the size of that frontal lobe in comparison to the rest of the brain. Now, that is the brain's symphony leader. It's the brain's CEO. It's the boss of the brain. And when we become truly focused and we truly pay attention, the frontal lobe does this amazing thing. On functional brain scans, when a person is in deep meditation or they're in prayer and reverie, the moment they become so involved in it, the frontal lobe begins to act like a volume control. And it literally lowers the volume to the circuits in the brain that process time and space. And on a functional scan, when a person is truly intentional, the frontal lobe lowers off or lowers down the circuits in the brain that have to do with feeling the body, the sensory cortex. The lights are turned out there. It cools off the circuits in the motor cortex that process movement, so the body becomes very still, and the brain goes into trance. It cools off the association centers in the temporal lobe that has you identify with everything in your environment, people and problems and things. It cools off the emotional centers in the deep brain, and it even cools off the circuits in the parietal lobe that process time and space. And now, like a symphony leader, as it cools off all those circuits, what happens is the brain begins to catch the thought as the experience. And the moment the thought becomes the experience, the brain thinks that it's real. And it captures the thought as the experience and upscales its hardware to reflect the thought as the experience. And the moment that happens, all the survival centers where we spend 90% of our time living, they turn off. The adrenal glands shut off, and all the physiological functions that have to do with survival, they change because the identity is now vacated. And we move into a state of creation. And in a state of creation, the one way you know that you're in a state of creation is that you forget about yourself. In other words, you become so involved with what you're thinking about or so involved with what you're doing that you forget about you. And the moment the identity is vacated, those survival centers turn off and energy moves right here. And people start to feel joyful. And they start to feel happy. And they start to fall in love with their creation. So when we live in survival and the chemicals of stress, those chemicals endorse the ego, which has us become very over-focused on the body, the environment, and time. But in a state of creation, there is no body, there is no thing, and there is no time. And the brain begins to change physiologically. So we live in two states of mind. We either live in survival or we live in creation. In survival, we're very selfish, and in creation, we're very selfless. And as we begin to allow that energy move to a new place, and we begin to remove the masks of those emotions that we've memorized, that intelligence that's keeping your heart beating and digesting your food, it begins to leak out of you. In other words, you begin to remove those emotions, and that same intelligence that's both loving intelligence and intelligent love begins to move through you, and you become more like it. You become more selfless. You become more giving, more loving, more caring. And so these people that had a spontaneous remission, it really wasn't too spontaneous at all. As a matter of fact, there were a couple minor things they had in common, and one of them was that they said, I just knew I was better. And I said, how did you know? And they said, I just knew that I knew. And I said, well, what do you mean? And they said, I didn't care if I had to take a test or not take a test. I knew I was different. And that's my definition of enlightenment, by the way, knowing that you know. The other thing they had in common is that the doctors all thought that they were very crazy. Now, is there anything wrong with that? Doesn't that make sense? If you have a heart condition or if you have a health condition, you go to the doctor and they give you a protocol to follow. Well, that's conventional treatment. But you see, the conventional treatment wasn't working for these people. So when we risk the chance of performing a miracle, we'll always look foolhardy or insane. Until what? The miracle happens, and then you're a saint in a matter of seconds. And so when they began to produce results, all the doctors said the same thing. I don't know what you're doing, but whatever you're doing, keep doing it. So we have three brains in one that allow us to go from thinking to doing to being. The thinking brain is the neocortex. That is the big walnut on the outside. And that's the home of conscious awareness. You're listening to me right now with your neocortex. And every time you learn something new, you're wiring new circuits in the thinking brain. That information, by the way, is just philosophy. Now, if you read the book on compassion by the Dalai Lama, and all of that information is wired in your thinking brain, but you haven't had the experience of compassion, it would be a good idea that when you're going to have dinner with your mother-in-law, to begin to think about how I could change my behavior, and if I'm able to modify my actions and do what the book said, if I apply what I learned, if I personalize it, if I demonstrate it, if I can change myself in some way, that change should produce a new experience in my environment, and that new experience should produce a new emotion. So now as you're driving to dinner to see your mother-in-law, all of a sudden you start thinking, oh, I don't want to see her. She's going to be a complaint. You start doing all of that. And then you say, oh, maybe I'll actually do what the book said. I'm supposed to see myself in her. I'm supposed to be present. I'm supposed to listen. I want to feel what she's feeling. And so you modify something about your actions. And all of a sudden, as you're sitting there, you have this new feeling of your mother-in-law. And that new experience produces the emotion of compassion. And the moment you're able to feel compassion, we could say now that you are now teaching your body through feelings what your mind has intellectually understood. So knowledge is for the mind and experience is for the body. And since feelings and emotions are the end product of experience, when we modify our behavior and there's a new feeling that's created, we are teaching the body what the mind has intellectually understood. And now for the first time, mind and body are working together. And you all of a sudden feel it and you embody it. You embody compassion. You have the knowledge of compassion. And now we turn on new genes and turn off old genes. But it's not enough to forgive your mother-in-law once. It's not enough to go to church and shake hands with someone and say, peace be with you, and then get in your car and cut people off to be the first one out of the church. When we have our behavior matching our intention, like nobody here does that. When we have our behaviors matching our intention, when our actions are aligned with our thoughts, that's when we have mind and body working together. But doing it once is not enough. We have to be able to repeat the experience over and over again, over and over again. Because when we have mind and body working together, that second brain, called the limbic brain or the emotional brain, is signaling the body. So the body understands what it feels like. But if we keep experiencing compassion over and over again, over and over again, over and over again, we begin to neurologically and chemically condition the body to memorize compassion better than the conscious mind. And when we do that, we activate the third brain called the cerebellum or the subconscious brain. So how many people here at a certain point in their life couldn't remember a phone number consciously? But then you pick up the receiver and you do this. You dial it. Well, what's up with that? I mean, you couldn't consciously remember it, but you practiced it so many times that your body knew better than your brain. Now, 90% of who we are sits in that subconscious program by the time we're 35. And that's where skills and emotional reactions and behaviors and conditioning and habits all exist. So if we're able to memorize compassion so well that nothing in our environment can move us from it, we could say now we've mastered compassion. So how many people here know someone who's mastered suffering? Doesn't have to be you. And you said to them, hey, listen, I know you're really suffering, but listen, did you read the book I gave you? No. Did you go online and check out that site? No. Did you see the DVD of that lady? No. Hey, listen, we're going to go to dinner and we're going to meet up with some friends. We're going to see some stand-up comedy, and then we're going to go for a walk and eat ice cream. You want to go? No. Well, what are they saying? I've memorized this state of suffering so well, both neurologically and chemically, that nothing in my environment will change it. No person, no thing, no experience. Well, those same three brains that allow us to go from thinking to doing to being allow us to memorize more altruistic states. And when we are in a state of being, when the mystics talked about being it, what they really meant is when mind and body were working together. And the quantum field, by the way, responds to whoever you're being. So yesterday I was joking about my Italian grandmother, praying with intention for her life to change, but feeling guilty. Her prayers ever get answered? No. Because if body has become the mind and she's memorized guilt, she has mind and body working in opposition. How about the person who thinks positively? Oh, you positive thinkers. But they've memorized negativity because they've been thinking and feeling that way for the last 30 years. And it only takes one stray thought or one reaction to the environment, and that program runs automatically, and that person returns back to the old self. So to change then, we have to get into the operating system of the subconscious. And that's where we begin to practice thinking and intending without the environment. The whole purpose of meditation, the word meditation means to become familiar with, to make known. If you become familiar with your unconscious thoughts, your unconscious actions, and your unconscious feelings, and you're sitting there observing how you are when you're thinking and feeling that way, you're meditating. You're becoming familiar with the old self. And if you began to practice a new ideal of yourself, and you practiced it every single day, over and over again, there would come a moment by your mere repetition that it would start to become familiar to you, just like the piano players. So you would begin to realize that change has to do with releasing the old self and reinventing a new self, or breaking the habit of the old self and recreating a new self. What we call in neuroscience pruning synaptic connections and sprouting new connections. Reconditioning the body to a new mind and unmemorizing the emotion that's stored in the body. And so in most people, when it comes down to that feeling that they never want to look at, it's so much easier to turn on the television or get on the internet or get on your cell phone so that you don't have to experience that feeling. And what happens to us by the time we're 30 years old, 35 years old, most of us have emotions that we've memorized, but we do really well because we can use the environment and all the people and all the things in our life to distract us from this feeling. You meet new people, you get married, you have kids, you start this life, you buy new things, you live in these places, and all of that works really good till you get to about your mid-30s, and then guess what happens? You can predict the feeling of every experience. And you begin to realize that nothing's going to make this feeling go away. So there's this gap between the way we appear and who we really are. And the way we appear is the identity that identifies with the environment. And we need the external environment to remember who we are as a somebody. And we can distract ourselves from this feeling really well to a certain point in our life where all of a sudden the feeling's not going away as easily. And so all of a sudden you turn to your husband and you say, I don't love you. What? Or I don't want to do this any longer. And then all of a sudden your family takes you to the doctor. They give you Prozac, and there you go, returning right back to the same person. And then there's other people who go through the midlife crisis, right? They don't want to look at this feeling, so what do? They buy the sports car. A new thing is going to make that feeling go away. And they can identify that external thing out there that produced this internal change. And it goes away for a while. Or the boat. Or the affair. Or going on vacation to a new place. Or joining the social club to get all these new people to now reinforce their identity. And all those people have joined the social club for the same reason, because they feel empty. And when all of that wears off, they realize they're still that same person. So you know what they do next, right? You see, this is, when you die and the environment is taken away, this is who you really are. You could be the most beautiful, the most attractive, the most successful, the most important person in the world. But if you haven't overcome this feeling, when the environment disappears and you die, this is who you really are. So other people, you know what they do? They go to addictions, right? Drugs and alcohol, shopping, gambling, video gaming, pornography, whatever it is. What can produce an immediate chemical change that makes this feeling go away? Now here's the problem. Every time we do something that's addictive, every time we create that chemical change, the next time we shop, the next time we gamble, the next time we use a drug, we need a little bit more. Because the receptor sites on the outside of the cells become desensitized. And so you're going to have to do a little bit more to produce the same rush. And so the pleasure centers in the brain keep recalibrating themselves to a higher level. Now you got to gamble. If you gambled for $10,000, now it's $20,000. If you shopped and you spent $3,000, now you got to spend $5,000. If you played video games for 1 hour, now you got to play for 2 hours. If you did one line, now you have to do 2 lines of coke. It always means that we have to keep stimulating the receptor sites because they become desensitized to the chemistry. It's like living with a spouse who always yells at you. They have to yell a little louder the next time. Receptor sites are the same way. So what do we do then in our life when we realize that nothing in our environment is going to make the feeling go away? We have to look at that feeling, and we got to begin to become conscious of it. We got to begin to look at it, and we have to begin to release it to a greater consciousness, to a greater mind. And that's doing the work. How do I think when I feel this way? How do I act when I'm in that emotional state? What other emotions drive me? And because we have this big frontal lobe, we can observe our own thoughts. We can observe our own actions. We can observe our own emotions. And that skill is called metacognition. And that's the first step to change. So the book I wrote is called Evolve Your Brain, The Science of Changing Your Mind. And it's a lot about my research into spontaneous remissions and going from thinking to doing to being. The second book that's coming out is called Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself, How to Lose Your Mind and Create a New One. And it's based on the workshops that I do. Now, I want to just talk about the different memory systems of the brain. We have 2 memory systems of the brain. One memory system of the brain is called declarative memories. And now check this out. Declarative memories are just memories that you can declare. Pretty easy, right? So I know that I'm a man. I know that I like garlic mashed potatoes. I knew I grew up in an Italian household. I know I pay taxes on April 15th. I know a few things about neuroscience. I know a few things about health. I know a few things about nutrition. Why? Because I've either learned these things intellectually or have I experienced them in my life. And this is the autobiographical self. So if you learn something new, you're going to use your thinking brain. If you apply it and you personalize it, you demonstrate it, now you're going to have a new experience, and that new experience is going to create a new feeling or a new emotion. Now we have mind and body working together. Now you've just gone from thinking to doing. Getting people to go from thinking to doing is like pulling elephants through quicksand. Because everybody wants to stay in the intellectual realm. Remember, knowledge without experience is called philosophy. Experience without knowledge is called ignorance. But if we keep practicing and we keep doing it, we begin to activate this last memory system called the non-declarative memory system. This is where you've practiced it so many times, you don't even have to think about doing it. As a matter of fact, you've memorized it so well that it's automatic. Now, this is who we are. 90% of who we are by the time we're 35 years old sits in this subconscious or unconscious program where our skills and our habits, our behaviors, our attitudes, our emotional reactions exist. So the person may consciously want to be happy, but they've memorized unhappiness, so they have mind and body working in opposition. So when a person begins to become conscious of their unconscious habits, and they begin to look at them, we would say then they're going into the operating system of the subconscious and beginning to become familiar with those particular states. Now, most therapies that work, by the way, in energy medicine or EMDR, emotional freedom technique, a lot of these new energy medicine techniques, they're working on this subconscious system here. The person can do all the talk therapy in the world. They can have all the insights. They can understand there's a chemical balance in their brain. They can understand that their father was overbearing when they were a child. They could understand, they could go to the psychic, and the psychic can tell them they were burned at the stake at Carcassonne, and that's why they are that way. But guess what? It doesn't change behavior at all. And so, while a lot of these new energy medicine techniques are working on this implicit program, and that's where we begin to unmemorize different states of mind and body. This is mental rehearsal. This is physical rehearsal. This is the union of mental and physical rehearsal, or the neurological self. Mind, body, soul, knowledge, experience, wisdom. It's all the same. So because we can make thought more real than anything else, do you know that you could sit down and if you asked yourself, what is a greater ideal of myself? Do you know that in a matter of moments, if you said, I'm not going to get up until I am this person, if the thought became the experience, the end product of the experience is a new feeling. And you would actually get up thinking one way, then feeling that way, and you would be in a state of being just through the process of meditation. Now, some people would say to me, Joe, well, is this like fake it till you make it? And I'd say to you, did you ever have a sexual fantasy? The moment you got involved in that sexual fantasy, you began to think about that fantasy, and you became so focused on it that what happened? You started to physiologically respond as if the event was real. Your body began to do some things, right? And you began to feel a little horny. And you would begin to be sexual. What about if you're driving to work and you begin to think about telling your boss off or an employee, and you begin to rehearse that all day long as you're driving? And you become so involved in the experience that the next thing you know, you slam the door and you get out of the car, walking, talking, insane person. But all you were doing was driving. But your brain became so focused on that confrontation that your body began to respond as if it was real. And you began to feel the emotion that was connected to the experience in your mind. Your mind made the experience that real, and the moment it did, you began to signal your body to feel aggressive. And when you got up, you were ready for battle. So could you then ask yourself, what is a greater ideal of myself? And begin to think about what that person would be like. And if you became so involved in the thought process that the thought became the experience, the moment the thought became the experience, we would produce a new emotion. And the moment that happened, now we're conditioning the body to a new mind. And when you got up and you memorized that state so well that nothing in your environment could move you from it, we would say that person is being happy. And once we're in a state of being, we're more prone to do things and think things equal to who we're being. That's the true process of change. So learning, it requires getting some knowledge. Instruction is teaching us how to do it. And feedback, by the way, is the most important point. If you're going to wake up in the morning and create a destiny, wouldn't it be a good idea to say to that mind that's both within you and all around you, hey, if you're real and I made contact with you, show me a sign today that we have a two-way relationship. This isn't just about me talking to you. I want you to talk back to me. And I want you to show me in my life with some event. And bring it in such a way that I could never predict. Because if I can predict it, guess what? It's not new. It's familiar. And surprise me so it leaves no doubt that it's come from you. So that I'm inspired to do it again. And once we notice what we did inside of us that produced that effect outside of us, making and paying attention to this internal change and looking to see the result it produced outside of us is the quantum law. We spend most of the time doing what? Reacting to something outside of us and noticing how we feel inside of us. So can you then begin to correlate what you do internally to produce that effect externally? That is the quantum model. Mental rehearsal is thinking about it. Physical rehearsal is the demonstration. This is the neurological self. Thinking, doing, being, three brains, neocortex, midbrain, cerebellum, knowledge, experience, wisdom, mind, body, soul. Intention and behavior creates a destiny when our behaviors align with our intention. Our thoughts and our feelings create the memorized self, that cycle of thinking and feeling. The thought sends the signal out in the quantum field. The feeling draws the event back, and that's how we have manifestation. The thought or the intention is the electrical charge in the quantum field. The feeling or the emotion is the magnetic charge, and how you think and feel is the electromagnetic field that you create, that you broadcast, that affects every single atom in your life. So, heard of this thing about intention, how powerful intention is? If you take a group of people that are expert prayers and you set 3 vials of DNA in front of them and you say, now intention means getting clear on what you want. Get clear and see that DNA unwind over and over again. And they practice it over and over again, these expert prayers. Do you know at the end of the experiment, guess what happens to the DNA? Nothing. If you tell another group of expert prayers, hey, move into an elevated mood of gratitude or love or goodwill and inspiration and just radiate out that emotion and let's see what that does to the DNA. You know what it does? Nothing. But if you say to that person, we want you to get clear on that DNA unwinding and then move into the feeling of what it would feel like if you unwound that DNA and emanate the gratitude and joy of what it would feel like, guess what happens? 25% of the DNA unwinds at a remote location. So the thought is the electrical charge. The intention is the electrical charge. The feeling is the magnetic charge. And how we think and feel creates the electromagnetic field that affects everything in our life. So, 3 brains. Neocortex is this yellow one on the outside. That's the thinking brain. This one's about the size of an apricot. This is the midbrain or the limbic brain. That's the emotional brain, the chemical brain. And this is the being brain. This is the microprocessor. Thinking, doing, being. 3 brains in one. So plasticity is our brain's ability to change its synaptic wiring by learning new things and having new experiences, and it's being able to maintain a modified state of being. Plasticity allows us to evolve our actions or modify our behaviors so we can do a better job in life. Neurorigidity is keeping the brain the same. It's never learning from experiences. It's keep firing the same inherited encoded genetic connections without ever changing them. Rigidity is the process of the same thoughts and perform the same actions and secretly expect something to show up differently. And of course, we know that's insanity. Plasticity is learning new things. It's creating new experiences. It's making new memories. Rigidity is living life from past memories without learning new things and having new experiences. Neuron is the simplest functional unit of a nervous system. Neurons are unique because they can communicate with each other, which makes them so different than other cells. This is a neuron. It's found in the neocortex, about 40 connections in the thinking brain, 40,000 connections in the thinking brain. You take a grain of sand that's filled with gray matter. You have about 100,000 neurons in a grain of sand, making over 100 billion circuits communicating with each other. They communicate in all different directions. They're 3-dimensional. If you took a scoop of gray matter the size of a pea and you stretched it out end to end, it would go 2 miles long. Now, if you learned anything new this weekend, or anything new in this lecture, you made a new connection, and this is what it looks like. I'm kind of paying attention to him. It's a little cold in here. I wonder if he's from New York. He talks kind of fast. Oh, that makes sense. Oh, I understand. Let me think about what it would be like to be happy. Nerve cells that fire together, wire together. You want to see a new experience? You want to see change? Unhooking from the old self, reconnecting to the new self. Real time, by the way. You want to see the aha phenomenon? One whole neural network connecting with a whole other neural network. Your brain does that on a moment-to-moment basis. Real time. I slowed it down, actually. You want to see a new experience? Watch. Gangs of neurons stringing together to reflect the environment. This is plasticity, and the only way this happens is by learning and changing and experiencing new things. Now, remembering is maintaining or sustaining those connections. Once they've fired together, they wired together, and now they're in a long-term relationship. This could be joy or this could be suffering. But these neurons are now hardwired together. They're in a long-term relationship. And just like any relationship, the more they communicate, the stronger their connection. So if you keep thinking about mentally rehearsing suffering all day long, and then someone asks you how you do and you physically demonstrate it, we would agree then that over time you would wire yourself to be an expert sufferer or victim. Hebbian learning says nerve cells that fire together, wire together. You know that? There's two ways we make connections in the brain. Learning information or knowledge or philosophy, that's called semantics. And episodic memories, having new experiences or embracing new events in life. This is a chemical that's released when the brain is learning new things. It's called neural growth factor. And neural growth factor causes neurons to sprout new connections. These are neurons with no new neural growth factor. And if we keep repeatedly firing a new thought over and over again, the neurons begin to release this miracle grow, this glue that begins to form more enriched synaptic connections. They're like Italians on cell phones. They want to communicate with each other. So a neural network is just gangs of neurons that have fired and wired together to form a community of neurosynaptic connections. Neural networks can be a concept, an idea, thought process, a memory, a skill, a behavior, or an action. These are the automatic programs. You have a neural network to brush your teeth. You have a neural network to tie your shoes. You have a neural network to speak English. You have a neural network to walk. These are the automatic programs. Now here's a neural network. This is the chemical component of neurons. They look like spaghetti. And because we have 100 billion neurons in our brain, we can fire them in so many different sequences, patterns, and combinations. The brain is completely plastic. Braille readers have so many more dense connections in the area of their brain that has to do with these two fingers because that's where their mind is. They fired and wired it. Want to see a new thought? Watch. There's a thought. Want to see it again? There's a thought. Your brain generates more electrical impulses in one day than all the cell phones on the planet put together. 400 billion times in 1 second. There's also, Hebbian learning says that nerve cells that no longer fire together no longer wire together, which means the moment you stop being the old person, thinking the same thoughts and performing the same behaviors and memorizing the same feelings, if you don't use those circuits any longer, guess what happens? You lose them. They become weakened and they begin to break apart. I call this the neurobiology of change or throwing out the mental trash. So here's a neuron now. This neuron's going to your body. And you're just sitting at home now and you're saying, well, what's a greater ideal of myself? Let me think, let's see, what would it be like to be happier? Maybe I'll think about being healthy, and I'm not going to get up until I feel it. And so you're going to fire this new thought. This blue neuron here is called health. We'll just use health for today. So you sit down, you close your eyes, you begin to think without the environment, you have an intention, and you fire this new thought called I am healthy. And so as you begin to fire that new thought, there's only one problem. You fired and wired all of these other circuits from other neural networks. And then all this stuff's going on at the same time while you're trying to focus on health. You're saying, you're not healthy, you're a loser, you're just like your father. Lay down and go to sleep. All the voices are happening in your head, and you're trying to fire this new thought called health. And all those voices that are coming from old circuits that are connected to the body-mind, and that body-mind is driving our very thoughts and behaviors. But we have this amazing quality as human beings called free will, and will is connected to our spirit. And if we insist over and over again, and we keep firing the same thought, repeated, independent of all the other chatter that's going on in our head, what I call awfulizing, if you keep doing it over and over again, and keep insisting on it with intensity and frequency and duration, there comes a moment that signal to this cell becomes the strongest signal. And the moment that's the strongest signal, I am healthy, to this cell, because you've repeatedly insisted on it with your intention and attention, now this action potential that's traveling down the neuron is becoming the strongest frequency to this other neuron. And the moment that happens, the neural growth factor that glues the circuit wants to become more hardwired. So there's only a certain amount of neural growth factor to go around. So it starts to take the neural growth factor from these other circuits. So there goes the memory of what the doctor told you. There goes the pain in your back. There goes your thoughts about being like your father. There goes your unworthiness. And what's the only circuit connection that's traveling to your body now? I am healthy. And that's how those people made measurable changes in their life. So, can you sit down tomorrow and ask yourself, what can I be today, and can I memorize this state? And if your body begins to rage and tell you you're a loser or whatever else, just because you have a thought, it doesn't necessarily mean it's true. Those are old circuits that are connected to feelings that you've memorized in your body. And if you sit there and you say, you know what, body? You're going to be so glad that I'm making you sit here, because we're not getting up until I am this person. What would happen in your life as a result of your conscious efforts? So, my last question. Can you believe in a future that you can't see or experience with your senses, but has already happened enough times in your mind that now your brain is literally wired to reflect it? In fact, our brain will be physically changed and now be ahead of the actual experience. And when that occurs, our brain is no longer a record of the past, but now, in fact, a map to the future. Now the mind is controlling the environment instead of the environment controlling our mind. And to live by this law is to live by the quantum law. And the quantum law says our environment is an extension of our mind. When we change our mind, our life changes.
To see another amazing Joe Dispenza talk, check out the video right there next to me. I think you'll love it. Continue to believe, and I'll see you there.
The quantum law says that the environment is an extension of your mind. And if the environment is truly an extension of your mind, how many people believe if they change their mind, something should change in their life? So to change them,